Hello, and how are you today? My name is Chris Nudo, and today we are going to be talking about Illinois real estate transactions. I am an attorney in the Chicagoland area, primarily serving the northwest suburbs of Chicago, with offices in Arlington Heights and in Elgin. And my practice focuses on estate planning, probate, real estate, and other commercial type transactions. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to be diving into the topic of Illinois real estate transactions. And I want to give you a little background on why I chose today's topic. Buying and selling a home is one of the most important transactions in a person's life. It usually signifies a new chapter in one's life. Whether it's your first home that you're purchasing right out of school, or it's the family home that you're purchasing as possibly your second home when you're starting a family, or it could be time to downsize out of that big home into something a little more manageable as you enter your retirement years. Traditionally, the next chapter of one's life is signified by the buying or selling of some form of real estate. It is a major capital purchase that has many impacts upon one's life. And so today we're going to be talking about the process and the fundamental elements of the transaction. No matter what your motivation is for buying and selling a home, it's critical that you get as much information about the process as possible, as early as possible, so that while you're in the process, your anxiety levels will be lower. I can tell you, I handle hundreds of transactions annually and thousands over the course of my career. And when I buy and sell my own real estate, the emotional part of the transaction can be overwhelming. And so I know what you're going through when contemplating to buy and sell a home. And the more information you have, the better you'll be equipped and the lower your anxiety will be. In today's discussion, I want to address a few areas I get the most questions about. I have saved time at the end of this to address questions that many of you may have. Feel free to comment below and be sure to respond, and I'll be sure to respond with the best answers to your questions. Okay, so here's kind of the four main high-level topics that we're going to dive into. The basic legal requirements of buying and selling a home in Illinois. And by the way, I think I want to put a little caveat around that. Illinois and the Chicago metro area, because Illinois is a very large state. And when we start getting into central Illinois and southern Illinois, the real estate process fundamentally is the same, but the logistical part of it is different. And so what we're really going to be focusing on in the details is the Chicago metro area, which really will describe Cook County, Lake County, DuPage, Kane, Will, and McHenry. I think I got them all. You're going to want to know what an Illinois real estate lawyer is responsible for in the transaction. You're going to want to know how to know if your attorney is qualified to represent you in the real estate transaction, and then what to expect during the process. So, ready? Let's get started. So the basic requirements of a real estate transaction is that you have to have a seller that wants to sell something, and you got to have a buyer who wants to buy something, and they have to agree. And while that seems so fundamental, it is the essence of how a real estate transaction gets started. I have a house that I need to sell. You like my house and you want to buy it. In the old days, we would scoop a piece of dirt and we would hand it to our buyer, and the buyer would hand us something of value, and away we would go, and that was a real estate transaction. Today, it is a tad more complicated, but the good news is we don't get covered in dirt, right? Okay. The essence, though, is the same. And a real estate transaction is represented by a real estate contract. Now, to understand the real estate contract and the process, we need to go to some basic fundamentals of what a contract is. And a contract is an offer by a buyer to buy a piece of real estate, and it is an acceptance of that offer by the seller to sell that piece of real estate, and there's got to be an exchange of consideration. That's the purchase price. So in a real estate transaction, the way we handle it here in the Chicago metro area is the buyer will prepare a form real estate contract. The most popular one used in the Chicago metro area, but outside of the city of Chicago proper, is the multi-board residential real estate contract. I have one right here. So this contract works as an offer, an acceptance, and builds in the consideration. So when you're going to buy a piece of real estate, the very first thing you want to do is you want to have a contract filled out with the terms that you want to use to present to the seller. And what you do is literally fill out the contract. You can use realtors do this most often, but if you're not using a realtor, a lawyer can help you fill out the contract. And then you physically present it to the seller, and that is called an offer. And then the seller will review the terms, and we will go over those kind of terms, and will either accept, reject, or counter your offer. When the seller and the buyer agree on the terms of the transaction, now we have a contract. So what are some of the items, some of the things that one must consider when making an offer? By the way, the flip side of this is true too. If you're a seller and you get an offer, what are some of the things you need to consider? Well, first and foremost, the very first thing and most important is going to be the purchase price, right? If you're a seller, there's a certain amount of money that you want to get for the sale of your property. And as a buyer, there's a maximum amount of money that you're willing to pay for that piece of property. By the way, when a seller and a buyer agree on a price, we call that market value, because the definition of market value is when a buyer and a seller agree on the price of a piece of property. So we have the purchase price. The second thing to consider is what comes with the piece of property. Because let's face it, if you're buying a home, you have the land that it sits on, you have the physical structure of the home, and then you have the things within it. So things like, are you buying a home that already has appliances? Are you buying a home that has a swimming pool? Are you buying a home or selling a home that has a pool table or other types of recreational things? Is it furnished? Is it not furnished? Also, one must consider how old are the furnishings. But let's keep going. Other items you need to consider is earnest money. Now, what is earnest money? Earnest money is a fancy term for a deposit. So when you present the offer to the seller, you say, hey, seller, I want to pay $100,000 for your home, and I'm willing to put up $2,000 in earnest money to earnestly show you that my offer to pay you $100,000 at closing is genuine. And the seller needs to ask themselves, is $2,000 on a $100,000 acquisition a true earnest deposit? And I will tell you, in the Chicago metro area, the answer would be yes. Other items to consider is, do you want to negotiate with the seller for some form of closing cost credit? Very often, a seller who is motivated will offer to pay part of the buyer's closing costs. And you ask yourself, well, why would a seller offer to do something like that? Well, because, you know, when a seller is selling, it's a business transaction. They have thought to themselves in their head, hey, you know, my property's probably worth between $95,000 and $100,000. If somebody's willing to pay me the top end of what I believe my property is worth, then I'm willing to help the buyer a little bit with covering a few of their closing costs, thereby a win-win. It's an enticement for the buyer, and it is a good faith gesture of the seller. And because it's a business transaction, the economics of it make sense. Next thing to consider for the parties is, when are you going to close the transaction? Now, I always thought, as I was growing up and hearing all about real estate transactions, this thing called a closing. It's what a weird term, but it makes sense. The closing is actually the physical day that title transfers from the seller to the buyer. We have the offer and the acceptance, and we get a contract. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be done, which can take 30 to 60 days. And then once those things are completed, the parties show up to a closing. Now, these days, there's not a physical presence that we show up to for a closing, but this is, in a very real sense, the day that the seller and buyer exchange the title. So, like I had mentioned, we like to set that date 30 to 60 days out. And you may be saying, gosh, what happens during that period of time? Thank you for that question, by the way. This is what happens. Let's talk about the buyer side of the transaction first. So once a contract is put together between a buyer and seller, and they agree on the terms, now the buyer is going to do some what we call due diligence items. These due diligence items include a physical home inspection. This is where they really get into the nuts and bolts of the home, and they can better assess what it is they are purchasing. They can look at the age and how the age of the mechanicals of the home, appliances, things of that nature, HVAC. They can look at the structure of the home, foundation, walls. And so this is where the buyer gets a chance to kick the tires, if you would, and then decide whether or not the perceived $100,000 value that they're purchasing the home for is really worth the $100,000. Also, up in the Chicago metro area of Chicago, this is the time where the buyer's attorney reviews the terms of the contract and decides whether or not any adjustments to the contract are necessary so that all of the expectations of the buyer are met. We're not going to get into those kind of nuances and details today. Just note that all experienced buyer real estate attorneys in Illinois have a set of contract modifications that are made to protect the buyer. So what's happening during this 30 or 60 days on the seller's side of the transaction? Well, first and foremost, title insurance needs to be ordered. What is title insurance? Title insurance is insurance, first and foremost, that will be given to the buyer, paid for by the seller, which is a guarantee of the condition of title from the seller to the buyer. This way, the buyer has an assurance at the closing that they have acquired the very best title that they can to that real estate so that they have maximized their $100,000. No buyer would want to spend money to buy a home just to find out that they only own a fraction of the home and not the entire home. Or in the sense of a condominium purchase, it would be terrible for the buyer to find out that they bought the condominium, but it didn't come with the parking spot they were promised. That may seem small in some areas, but in the city of Chicago, where a parking spot can go for $50,000 to $75,000, not getting the parking spot that you were promised is significant. So during this time, the seller will order title insurance. And this is where searches of the public record are done, searches of the buyer and seller's names to look for possible judgments, liens. We check to make sure taxes are paid current. We look to see if there's any outstanding mortgages. We look for things on title that would compromise the buyer's right to purchasing the home and getting free and clear title. Also, if this is a single family home or a townhome, a survey is ordered. Here in Illinois, in the Chicago metro area, we still exchange boundary surveys. This is to ensure there's no encroachments, which would mean the building is not placed on the property where it belongs based on the subdivision rules. And we look for things like fences and outbuildings like sheds or garages overlapping different boundary lines. And so it's very important that we get a survey to ensure that what you're buying is contained within the boundaries of the land that you're acquiring. If this is a condominium, this is where we get in contact with the condominium association. And we order what's called a resale package that will be a whole list of documents which will include the financials of the association, how much the association has in reserves for capital improvements. It'll disclose how many units are rentals versus owned by homeowners. It will disclose whether or not there's any commercial property with the homeowners association, you know, the buildings that have stores at the bottom and the residential units above. All of these things are very important for a buyer when analyzing their acquisition. There are a number of documents that need to be prepared to transfer the home from the seller to the buyer. First and foremost, the most important document is the deed. And the deed is the paper representation of the title. Now, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but I do want to explain something that is all the time misunderstood. You know, when you own a car, you have a title. And you can physically say, here's the title to my car. And when you sell your car, you take the title and you endorse it, and you give it to the buyer, and they give you money. And often people are like, where is my title to my home? And they mistakenly think, oh, the bank has it because I have a mortgage on my property. Much like a car title, the bank holds the title until your loan is paid. However, this is the education part. Real estate does not have a physical title. Real estate title ownership is considered a bundle of rights. And these are your rights to quietly live and enjoy the property that you have. But it's not represented by an actual physical title. So you might ask yourself, well, then how is title exchanged if there's no physical title? And the answer is the document is called a deed. And a deed represents your bundle of rights as it relates to that piece of property. When a seller gives a buyer a deed, he or she is giving the buyer a representation that he or she is transferring the bundle of rights and all of the bundle of rights to the buyer. But don't mistake the deed as title. It's merely a representation of title being transferred. That deed then is recorded in the county in which the property exists, and that is making the deed of public record, putting everybody on notice that title is now owned by the buyer. Now, there's other things in the home that don't transfer with the deed. What are some of those things? Microwave, dishwasher, washer and dryer, maybe bookshelves, maybe a lawnmower, all kinds of things that are not physically anchored to the home. So how are these items transferred during the real estate process? And the answer is the exchange of a document called a bill of sale. And so the seller will be preparing the deed, the bill of sale. There's also a number of other documents that represent the assurances made by the seller and in receipt of the buyer that each party is working in good faith to make sure that the seller gives all of their interest to the buyer and the buyer receives all of the interest from the seller. I know, sounds pretty complicated and confusing. And if you've never been part of the underbelly of a real estate transaction, these things can be. Hence the reason having a qualified real estate attorney in the Chicago metro area is very important. One of the things that get done when you're selling a piece of real estate is an existing mortgage needs to be paid off. So no buyer wants to buy a piece of real estate with the seller's existing mortgage on it. So this will also be the time where you obtain what's called a payoff letter from your mortgage company. And at the closing, when the buyer submits the money for the closing, part of that money will be used to satisfy the balance owed by the seller on any existing mortgage. So what are some of the other considerations in a real estate transaction? Well, taxes, right? you can't have a conversation without discussing taxes. In Illinois, our real estate taxes are paid in arrears, which means that in the present year, we are paying the previous year's taxes. So you may ask yourself, I'm at a closing and last year's taxes are not paid. So if I'm a buyer, when I buy this piece of property and I pay the real estate taxes, aren't I buying the property and owing taxes for a period of time when I did not own the property? And the answer is yes. So how do we settle this inequality? And the answer is called a tax proration. And what a tax proration is where the seller credits the buyer for the period of time that the seller owned the property up until the closing, so that when the buyer pays the real estate taxes, the seller has given the buyer the money, so the buyer is actually paying the real estate taxes with the seller's money. This is a very important concept. And so you'll find in every real estate transaction the proration of the prior year's real estate taxes. Also in Illinois, we have something that's called an Illinois seller's disclosure. And an Illinois seller's disclosure is a representation by the seller to help the buyer understand the property better. It covers things like any defects in the property that the seller is aware of, whether it would be foundation, whether it would be leaks, whether it would be cracks, it's a whole list of things. And when the seller gives the buyer this representation, it helps the buyer feel more comfortable that they're not being misled by the seller. Also, we have lead paint and radon disclosures. And what is radon? Radon is a gas emitted from the earth, which, according to some, is not healthy for you in certain levels. So we have two disclosures for lead paint and for radon gas in Illinois, so that any information the seller has about these items is transferred to the buyer. Now, most sellers these days have no idea about whether or not they have lead paint in their home, and most sellers these days don't really have any knowledge about whether or not they have radon gas in their home. But at least they're making a disclosure as to the fact that they don't have information. And by the way, if they do, they make it on the disclosure. We then, as attorneys for buyers, recommend that their buyers do radon gas testing to ensure that the radon gas levels in the house meet proper EPA requirements and don't exceed them. And if they do exceed them, that the home is mitigated for this radon gas. It's about all I'm going to say about that. So we've talked about what the seller has to do during this 30 to 60 day period, but what does the buyer have to do? Well, if the buyer's paying cash for the property, he or she needs to make sure that that cash is in a liquid state so that they can wire the money to the closing at the time of closing, or get a cashier's check if the amount that they need is under $50,000. If they are getting a mortgage for the property, then this is the time that the buyer will be working very diligently with the lender of their choice. Rocket Mortgage comes to mind by Quicken. They are a huge national lender, not my favorite, but I'm not expressing opinions. And They deliver to the mortgage company all the necessary documentation required so that that loan can be approved. It's also the time where the buyer's lender will order an appraisal of the property to ensure that the market value that the buyer and the seller have agreed to actually fits within the surrounding area of homes that are very similar. So that process of getting the appraisal and the underwriting of that loan typically takes 30 to 60 days, hence the reason why we like to set a closing date that's at least 30 days from the time that the buyer and seller have agreed to the transaction. So, just looking through my notes here, forgive me for a slight pause in the action. What are some other considerations that we need to consider in a real estate transaction? Well, sometimes there are contingencies that are part of the deal. What are contingencies? A contingency is, I will do my thing if this thing is met. Best example is when a buyer wants to buy a piece of real estate, but has to sell another piece of real estate because they won't have the money to buy your piece of real estate unless they sell their existing home. This is called a contingent offer. And so buyers and sellers need to discuss whether or not the buyer is required to sell a piece of real estate before they financially can purchase the new piece of real estate. And sellers have to decide, am I willing to put my house on the market and then wait for a buyer to sell their home before they're able to buy my home? And that's called a contingent offer. One other very popular provision is called the as is, where is provision of a contract. And this is where a seller sells the home in the condition that it is as it is, right? So a buyer looks at the home and buys it as is. Now, that seems pretty fundamental, right? Like, you know, I'm sure I'm buying it as is, but what if there's something wrong with the piece of real estate that you didn't know about? The home has a big foundation crack and you're going to have to fix that foundation crack. Well, this is where the parties have to decide, is the price that the buyer is paying representative of the condition of the home as the offer was made? And in a lot of instances, it is. You pay less money for a piece of real estate relative to the market, but you're buying it because the home is less than perfect. So, what should you expect from your Illinois real estate lawyer? Well, you should expect that you're on the buyer side, that your real estate lawyer reviews all of the necessary documentation that a seller needs to deliver so that when you're done with the closing, you have received 100% of everything that you had planned on purchasing. And as a seller's attorney, as a seller, you should expect that your attorney is adequately preparing 100% of the documentation necessary to satisfy the buyer's lawyer. And when you have two highly qualified real estate lawyers, you have a perfect transaction. The seller's attorney is preparing all the necessary documentation to transfer it to the buyer's attorney, who reviews it and tells the buyer, congratulations, you have received everything that the seller had to sell to you. And the seller is super excited. Why? because now they have a pile of money. That is the best part of selling real estate, is when you're done, you should have the equity in your home delivered to you in a nice check or wire transfer. So what do you expect during the closing? Well, if you're a seller, there's not a lot that you have to do at the closing. All the work is done ahead of time. All the preparation is done by your attorney. You sign all the documentation, and it gets delivered to the buyer's lawyer. At the closing, the buyer's lawyer reviews all of the documentation coming over from the seller, ensures that it's all prepared correctly, that it meets all the terms of the real estate contract, and then the end result is a thumbs up by the buyer's lawyer, and the closing is closed. Now, in Illinois, we close transactions at title companies. What is a title company? A title company is where the title insurance is issued. And we close them at title companies because the title company will add to their insurance the fundamental guarantee that the money coming in from the buyer is used to satisfy all the requirements of the seller, and that the title from the seller is completely transferred to the buyer. And while it's not the responsibility of the title company to make sure this is done correctly, they are fundamental in ensuring that when the buyer sends their money in, the money is actually used to pay the seller and not used for somebody to take a trip to Hawaii or something like that. So, and at the end of the closing, we end up with money for the seller and keys for the buyer. It's very exciting, actually. So, let's pause. And let me recap. Some of you joined us a little later during this presentation, and so let's go back to the fundamentals. My name is Christopher Nudo, and I'm the founding partner of an estate planning real estate law firm with offices in Arlington Heights and Elgin, Illinois. I serve our community by helping other professionals, parents, and neighbors plan for the buying and selling of new homes, preparing their wills and their trusts, and just helping in everyday important aspects of life and planning for the future. If you missed our last session, you can watch the video right here on our Facebook page. And last session, I explained what you need to know about the probate process and why trust administration is so important. It's an excellent overview for anyone unfamiliar with the benefits of estate planning and the probate process. We welcome you to join us here every Friday, where we share tips and legal guidance for parents, guardians, professionals, and people looking to buy and sell real estate. I noticed that a number of questions have come in while I've been describing the real estate process. And so we're going to try and take a few minutes now and review these questions. And let's see what we got. Question number one. What questions should I ask to make sure my lawyer can handle the closing? Great question. So I like to ask, I think every buyer and seller should ask their attorney, how familiar are you with the Chicago Metro real estate transaction process? Because every jurisdiction has its unique customs, and the metro area of Chicago is no different. And so you want to hire a lawyer that has closed many real estate transactions in the Chicago metro area and is familiar with the nuances of the municipality in which you are buying or selling. Question number two. What is a real estate lawyer's responsibility when working with a home buyer or seller? It's a great question. Honestly, I don't want to get too deep into that question. We kind of just spent the last 33 minutes going over the responsibilities of a buyer and seller's attorney. And so what I'd just like to say is please review the content that we just put forth. By the way, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to go back and re-review it over and over again to ensure that you understand the concepts I put forth earlier. What could go wrong if you don't have a lawyer when buying and selling a home? Well, this is an excellent point. If you don't have a lawyer and you're trying to sell a piece of real estate, there is the risk that you don't produce the necessary documentation to satisfy the buyer's attorney. And the buyer's attorney is going to make sure that the buyer is buying every bit of the bundle of rights that we described from the seller. And if the seller doesn't have good legal representation, he or she runs the risk of not successfully selling their real estate. On a buyer's end, if you don't have an attorney, guess what? You don't know the full bundle of rights that you're trying to get from the seller. And that bundle of rights really comes with experience that an experienced real estate attorney can provide. And so not having an attorney on the buyer's end, the risk you run is that you pay all this good money for the real estate and don't get all the benefits that come with it. What should I expect at the closing? Well, for the buyer, the closing is really the time where they sign all of their mortgage documents and receive all the documentation from the seller, which transfers the bundle of rights. And so at the closing, for a buyer, you should expect that you're going to get a series of documents that represent the seller's title in the property. Remember, there's no physical title, but all the documents that are used in the transfer process represents the bundle of rights. And also, you should expect to sign lots of loan documents for your mortgage so that the mortgage company can give you the money to help you with the acquisition of the loan. By the way, at the end of the closing, you should expect a set of keys. And why? Because now you own the property, and that's super exciting. If you're a seller, you're delivering all the documents to the closing. And what should you expect at the end of the closing? You should expect money. Yes, because you sold your property for money. And so when the process is completed, proceeds from your sale is what you should expect. How much does it cost to work with a real estate lawyer? Good question. Prices in the Chicago metro area vary, and they vary greatly. But I'm going to tell you that the average real estate lawyer should be somewhere between $550 and $1,200. Now, can you find attorneys that'll do transactions for less? Yes. Can you find attorneys that do it for more? Yes. But I will tell you that the majority fall somewhere within that range. I will tell you that I've been doing real estate transactions for $750 to $1,200 for a number of years. It's a fixed rate expense and a fixed rate cost, I should say. And but real estate lawyer fees are all over the board here in Chicago. By the way, I will tell you, like everything in life, you get what you pay for. Can I represent myself? Why do I need an attorney? I don't mean to chuckle. I'm sorry. But my experience is everybody, whether it's estate planning, real estate, traffic ticket, everybody asks the question, can I do it myself? And I always tell people, of course, you can do anything yourself as long as you figure out how to do it and you do it correctly. And so I don't mean to have some sarcasm in what I'm saying, but what I will tell you is buyers run the risk of not obtaining all that they paid for, and they're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for a piece of real estate. Is it worth it not to receive all that you contemplated to purchase if by chimping out on not paying for a lawyer? Or worse, on a seller side, you're selling your real estate for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Are you willing to risk that you don't get all of the proceeds from the sale of your house? These are major life events in the buying and selling of real estate. One should not use this exercise to do it yourself. Now, mind you, I am speaking from the Chicago metropolitan area. So if you're outside of Lake County, McHenry, DuPage, Kane, Will, if you're in outlying counties like possibly Winnebago or DeKalb County or some of the more southern counties, the process and procedures change. But as long as you're within the Chicago metro area, you should have a real estate lawyer. Do you offer virtual appointments or off-site visits? On-site visits, excuse me. Do you offer virtual appointments or on-site visits? Yes, we do. Going through your real estate transaction can certainly be handled virtually. We even handle the closings virtually now. There's only one thing that cannot be done virtually, and that is the documentation. All documentation for real estate transfers in Illinois is still done with a pen and with paper. And so there will be a time in which you will physically sign all the documents, whether you're on the buy side or sell side, but the majority of the transaction can be handled in a remote type setting. When can I contact you to set up a consultation? Now, I suppose the question was, where can I contact you to set up a consultation? It'd be good if I could read the questions. And well, look, right on the screen, you have my phone number, or you can text us. You can email us. I bet you there's something on the screen that has my email address and my address. And you just contact my office, set up a time, and we are happy to help you. As an aside, right now we have an amazing gentleman named Richard who answers the telephone, and he is amazingly equipped to answer your questions and get you set up so that our firm can help you. So, listen, let's wrap up. I want to thank all of you. It's amazing to me that you would join me today for this exciting topic on Illinois real estate law. I cherish the opportunity to work with you with your real estate transaction, to help you with a will, a trust, powers of attorney, and any type of estate planning needs, or even probate when one of your loved ones has passed away. Like anything, proper planning and process takes time, but that time will be worth it. And remember, all of this is for you. We work for you. I encourage you to reach out and start a discussion. And I would love to service your family, your parents, your siblings, your children. I invite you to join me here again for next week's Facebook Live on Fridays, 8 a.m. Central Time. Please feel free to invite your friends and your family and share my recordings with your parents, family members, and colleagues. I hope to see you again next week. Stay well. God bless. Thank you. Chris Nudo.